Alrighty, welcome back to my channel, May Between the Pages. My name is Taylor, and today we're going to be doing my April wrap-up. Now, April ended up being just an extremely busy month for me, much more than I expected, in some good ways and some bad ways. But I just didn't have as much time as I had predicted for reading, so I only have 5 books for you today, but most of them are really enjoyable reads, and I ended up finding one all-time favorite. Now, this first book, unfortunately, is not among those that were enjoyable, and that is House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas. I have a full rant review for this book. I will be sure to link it down below, so if you want to hear my full thoughts on this book where I just let out all of my frustrations with it and go into detail, please go check that out. But for today, I'll just say the character work in this book was horrendous. I ended up liking a lot of the characters less in this book than I did in the first book, which is the opposite direction you want that to go. The plot made literally zero sense. Like, I was just like, when I was reading this book, I would actually yell out loud, "What the fuck is this?" And my husband would just look at me like, "You okay?" And I'm like, "No," because this makes no sense. There's no logic to this book whatsoever. I ended up giving it 2 stars because, in my opinion, I think the smut was good. I know some people weren't a fan of it, but I did enjoy that aspect of this book. And there were a couple characters that I enjoyed. Rune being one of them, Fury, and Juniper, I think is her name. Is it Juniper? But I did enjoy those 3 characters, but besides that, this book just pissed me off. I also have here all of the tabs. A lot of them are orange, which mean frustration, anger, just not good stuff. So please go check out the full rant review if you want to hear my thoughts on this, but this was not it. This was not it. The next book, however, did make up for that, and that is Pride and Prejudice. I finally read this book. I've read quite a few classics in my life, but I had never picked up any Jane Austen before, and I figure Pride and Prejudice is a really good place to start. Elizabeth is such a wonderful character. She's so snappy and witty, and just the way she disses people in her posh language, oh my god, I adore her as a character, and I know why so many people do now. And Mr. Darcy just had a really late emo phase, or he never grew out of his emo phase, it appears, until someone slapped some sense into him. So I really did enjoy, their love story, which is the main part of the book that I knew the end result, but the little plots and twists in between and the family dramas, I managed to not spoil myself for that over all of these years. So that was really enjoyable to me, all the little plot twists and turns and the misunderstandings. I really, really enjoyed that aspect. Also, I listened to the audiobook of this, and the narrator was fantastic. Her name is Emilia Fox, I believe, and she did such a good job voicing all the different characters. I always knew who was speaking, and the way that she voiced Mrs. Bennet, like the hysteria that was put into her voice every time she was going on one of her tangents was just so enjoyable to me. So I really recommend the audiobook that's narrated by Emilia Fox, because that really added to my enjoyment of the story. But I ended up giving this a 4.5 because there were a couple points where I felt kind of my attention waning, in the way that it sometimes does with classics when, something is talked about for a bit too long. But I do think with the beauty of the writing, of Austen's writing, if I read this book physically and take in the words that way, I think this could get bumped up to a 5. I also love when authors take a kind of meta approach to the society in which they live, and Austen absolutely did that. She was poking fun at, her society left, right, and center, and it was just such a joy to read that. The commentary of the ridiculousness of the courting rituals at the time, the way that women were expected to act, and men as well, and just using characters who are kind of archetypes for societal expectations, having those characters be put in a ridiculous light so you can see how ridiculous it is. That was just beautifully done. The writing was amazing. And so now I am very much in the market for a nice edition of Pride and Prejudice. I may have picked the one that I think I'm going to go for. But if you guys have any suggestions of a really beautiful, nice edition of this book, which is a benefit of classics, there's so many editions, I would love to check them out. So make sure to drop the name of the collection down below. The next book is a third in a series of one that I've been reading for a couple months now, which is the Memoirs of Lady Trent series. So if you've watched my previous wrap-ups, you've heard me talk about this series, but Maria over on Tea Books Magic and a couple other people on BookTube are hosting a read-along where we read one of these books every month. The Voyage of the Basilisk is, as I mentioned, the third book in this series, and we follow Lady Trent as she goes on a world trip aboard a ship. And it's got the swashbuckling aspect to it, the dragons aspect to it that we've come to expect, as well as all of these commentaries on bigger themes than I expected from these books, such as feminism, motherhood, colonialism. I've mentioned this in my other reviews, but I really think that these books do a really good job of slipping in themes that you wouldn't expect to be handled so well. If you're not aware, this series follows our main character, Lady Trent, and these are her memoirs, as you can guess from the name, I guess. But we're reading an account she gives of her life. So in the very first book, we follow her when she's young, and she has developed this love, this passion for dragons. However, in her current society, being interested in science, particularly dragons, is very unladylike and frowned upon. And so she is having to fight uphill against society to be able to pursue what she's passionate about. In each book, the world gets wider, more expanded. Like I said, more themes are brought in, but every single one deals with a different type of adventure, a different environment, a different country that she goes to, and it keeps it fresh, it keeps it fascinating, and the dragons that we're looking at and studying change wherever she goes, so it's always something new. These books very much give me like Tomb Raider, Indiana Jones vibes, and this past one, since they're on the sea, brings in some pirates as well, that kind of nature to it. So if that sounds up your alley, along with descriptions and studies of dragons, I highly recommend this series to you. So if you can't guess, I gave this book 5 stars. So far, this has been a complete 5-star series for me. There are 5 books in the series, so we'll see if it can bring it home. But that is quite rare for me. The one that I can think of off the top of my head is the Greenbone Saga. That is a complete 5-star series for me. I guess Six of Crows and Cookie Kingdom were both 5 stars, but it's not a series, it's just a duology. But it's very rare for me to give an entire series 5 stars. And this one is shaping up to be that. And I don't know, I can't get enough of them. Every time I start listening to one of the audiobooks, I cannot put it down for the life of me. So, loved this book, and I'm excited to continue with the series as always. This next one, I'm going to have to do an individual review for this, I think, in the future, because I just have a lot to say. But that is Legacy of the Brightwash. This is a self-pub book that I've been meaning to pick up for months, and I finally got to it this month. And so many people told me, Taylor, you're going to love this. It's incredible. It's amazing. I'm like, yeah, I'm sure I'm going to love it. Excuse me, Miss Krystle. What gives you the right to make something this good? I am obsessed with this book. It's like grimdark with a romance subplot that gives you like a little dash, a little taste of hope within this very brutal world. It's so beautifully written. A couple of the lines, I just had to stop and take them in for a second. And the characters are exquisite. We follow our main character, Tashue Blackwood, who is kind of like a low level, or a normal level, I guess, cop in this world. His job is basically to keep tabs on or control what they call the tainted, or talented, depending on who you talk to. But the official name for these people is tainted. And essentially the tainted are those with magic. Those who have magic which has quickened, which can happen at any age, then are able to manifest those powers and are considered thus tainted. And so society controls these people very closely and forces them into jobs that keep the society running, lighting the lamps of the city, things like that, and forcing them, well, forced labor essentially, to use their powers for the greater good of society. They're very much viewed as less than, and a lot of people are afraid of them. So Tashue's job is to keep tabs on these people and make sure they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. But then one day, a little girl washes up on the shore who's had her arms and her legs cut off in a tattoo on the back of her neck. And something about this little girl triggers something in Tashue, and he cannot let it go. And he has to know what happened to this girl. So this starts an investigation and brings him into, political schemes and plots, and he starts to uncover the different layers of society. And maybe the laws he's been upholding aren't what he thought they were. There's also a romantic subplot, not really a subplot, a parallel plot with a character named Stella, and she is a fantastically written character, and she has a little girl that is just so wonderfully written. I would die for Sarah. I would die for her. There are some horrific scenes of just pain and death, and they're written in such a stark way that you can see them, you know, in front of you as you're reading it, and it's painful to read some of those scenes. But the balance between that and like the little moments of hope, the little moments of beauty, such a nice balance there. Also, I'm a huge lover of whiskey, and I'm pretty sure that Krystle is herself, because the number of like whiskey references and how whiskey is made, the whiskey nerd in me was like, oh, yes, a fellow whiskey nerd, because I just loved reading those little passages throughout the book. But if you're not a big fan of whiskey, you know, it'll just be another part of the world. But for me personally, that really stuck out as super enjoyable. I'm going to stop myself here because I could talk about this book for a really long time, and like I said, I want to do a separate review at one point. I do not have this book physically yet, and that is a crime, so I will be getting my hands on this soon. I plan to order it, so look forward to that review coming soon. But if you have not picked up Legacy of the Brightwashes, an SPFBO finalist from last year in 2021, well deserves that title. Please read it if you have not. It is one of my new all-time favorite books. The last book I read was crammed into the last 2 days of this month. I read it in 2 different sittings over 2 days, and that is Priest of Bones. I read this as part of a group read with Steve from Steve Talks Books and Yolene from Yolene Reads. We have a live spoilery discussion, so beware if you haven't read the book, but the live spoilery discussion will be linked down below, where we go into details about what we enjoyed and didn't enjoy, the characters, themes, things like that. It was a really good discussion. But just as a summary, we follow, what is our main character? our main character, Thomas Piety, who is a soldier coming back from the war. And we follow directly from his perspective and his perspective only. So the narrative voice wasn't my absolute favorite, and I think it had to have a lot of character because Thomas himself has a lot of character, and the author really wanted to play with that narrative voice, which I understand, but it wasn't exactly something that I enjoyed. I'm not a huge fan of Thomas's narrative voice. But taking that out of it, Thomas is a very interesting character because he, when he was away at war, he became a priest for basically the goddess of soldiers. And she's not merciful and doesn't really require much from her priests. So it's not your typical priesthood. So he kind of lives in this dichotomy of being a priest, a soldier, and a gang boss, which is where most of this book takes place. So he's coming back to his hometown with those who survived from his group in the war and coming back home to claim what is his as, you know, his gang's property, essentially. And so this story mainly follows him and his story after he comes home with his group of men. And it is more, I would say, of a character study than like super twisty plots, but the character studies are done well. Also, like a lot of grimdark books, there's a lot of playing with morally gray characters and making you question your own morality as you read the book, and I did really enjoy that aspect of it too. There were some characters that I wish we saw more of after the beginning of the story. They just kind of seemed to be shunted off the page like once their job was done. So that wasn't my favorite either, but the people that we did focus on were interesting. I will definitely say that. I also really loved the politics between the gangs. That was a lot of fun. So this book also has a lot of graphic scenes. It's grimdark. What do you expect, you know? So just be ready for that. Lots of, you know, entrails coming out and all that. So just be prepared for that when you do pick this up. But Steve did make a point in our live, which I agree with, which is if you are interested in getting into grimdark and you want to know if this is a type of world you would be comfortable reading about, Priest of Bones is a really good book to start with because it reads so quickly. I think it's about 350 pages and you can just blow through that. Like the writing style is so quick to read. So if you're interested in kind of dipping your toes and seeing if grimdark would be for you, this could be an option. It's also a low fantasy in the sense that the magic system isn't super developed. It's more like an aspect of the world and not a definitive system. So if you're not into like the super rigid systems where you have to take a lot of time getting to know the magic system, this series could also really work for you. That concludes my April reading. Overall, I think it was really good. I found a new all-time favorite, and besides House of Sky and Breath, which again, if you want to hear all the reasons and the rantiness, go to the review, but besides that book, I enjoyed everything that I read. So let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of these, if you have different opinions from me on some of them, and like I said before, if you have any recommendations for a nice Pride and Prejudice edition. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click that bell. I'd love to have you as part of this community, and I appreciate it. But for now, I'm gonna head out. Jane!